Welcome back to the Damn Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eva, and I'm glad you're joining me for this one. Today's conversation is one that many families never expected to find themselves needing, and yet for more and more parents, it becomes part of their story. We're talking about autism and multilingualism. And before we begin, it's important to start with something fundamental about autism itself. Autism is not a single experience, it isn't a profile, and it isn't one type of child. Today, we understand autism as a spectrum, not in the sense of mild or severe, or the outdated language of high functioning versus low functioning, but as a wide gradient of abilities, challenges, communication styles, and ways of experiencing the world. Every autistic child has their own unique combination of strengths and differences, which means that every family's journey and every child's development will look different. And that becomes especially important when we start talking about language, because for many international families, language isn't just about communication. It's about connection. It's about culture. It's about grandparents and home countries, identity, and belonging. So when parents receive an autism diagnosis, one of the questions that often arises quickly is, what happens to our languages? Do we continue speaking the languages of our family? Will multiple languages confuse our child? Are we making things harder for them? And unfortunately, many families are still told advice that forces them into an impossible choice. But what we are learning from research over the last decade is that bilingualism itself does not create additional language delays in autistic children. In fact, studies comparing bilingual and monolingual autistic children show no additional disadvantage in language development simply from being exposed to two languages. So today we're continuing our conversation with Mimi about multilingual families, but now through the lens of neurodiversity. And just like Mimi has reminded us in previous episodes, when we talk about raising multilingual children, there is no single rigid rule. A family's language plan is not a fixed decision you make once and never revisit. It is a living document. It evolves and adapts, and it responds to your child, your family, your environment, and the realities you encounter along the way. Because every child is different, and every family deserves the information they need to make thoughtful, informed decisions without fear. So today we're exploring what the research actually says about autism and multilingualism, what parents need to know, and how families can think about language in a way that supports both their child's development and their family's identity. Let's begin. Welcome back, Mimi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me.
So, Mimi, I just want to start with what probably is the first question many multilingual families ask when they receive the autism diagnosis. Can autistic children actually grow up bilingual, and what does the research really say about it?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is probably the first question, and not just probably, this is the first question many parents ask after a diagnosis. And very often the answer they hear is something like, well, your child is already struggling with one language. How about we make it easier for them or not complicated and stick to just the one language? And a piece of advice like this can sound absolutely devastating, because suddenly families are being asked to choose between their languages, their cultures, and consequently their relationships, because a lot of their relationships are connected with their various languages. But as you said, the important part here, research over the past decade doesn't support this advice. And studies consistently show that autistic children who grow up with more than one language do not experience additional language delays compared to their monolingual peers, to monolingual autistic children. So in other words, bilingualism does not harm their language development. And that's really, really important to hear. Honestly, if you can just take one sentence out of this podcast, this should be it. Because the fear around growing up with multiple languages and being on the autistic spectrum disorder is often based on outdated assumptions rather than on actual evidence.
Some things we've actually heard is parents have actually been told by doctors, therapists, and even educators that sometimes they're just told to stop speaking their home language. So I am curious from your perspective, why do you think professionals still sometimes recommend dropping a language?
Before I dive into this, I'm getting a little bit emotional. I've heard this from families, and I was a part of an online event. I was learning about the Dutch education system a few years ago myself. And there was somebody who was advising people also about juggling their languages. And it was the very end of this event. And the mom asked, she talked about her child being on the spectrum and she was desperate because she was looking for some confirmation of her feeling that she shouldn't be abandoning the languages. But as I said, that was at the very end. She was told, no, you better focus on just the school language, forget about everything else. And they kind of closed the discussion because we were well over time. And that really left me with, I couldn't get in touch with this mom to talk to her afterwards. But the feeling that, just like that, you just completely change somebody's trajectory. And for some, the reasoning might sound logical on the surface, but the very idea that if a child is already struggling with the language and you add another language to the mix might create confusion. As I said, perhaps common sense would call it logical, but we cannot call it logical without looking at the evidence, without looking at the research. And an assumption like this doesn't reflect how language works. And beyond this anecdotal example, I've also seen it in my personal circle. Children, including autistic children, they're absolutely capable of learning multiple languages. And what research shows us is that autistic children exposed to two languages, they develop their skills very similarly to their monolingual peers, to autistic children exposed to only one language. So the recommendation here, given by random people or some professionals to drop a language, honestly, it's more about simplifying the life of the adults than actually thinking about the children and what we can do to enhance their development and support their development.
Just wondering, do you know if there's any evidence that multilingualism environments can actually sometimes support communication in autistic children?
Absolutely. There's been a lot of research recently, especially in the last, I would say, maybe 5 years. And this research suggests that multilingual autistic children may actually show certain advantages in communication, cognitive flexibility, and so on. Let me give you some examples. Some studies have observed that bilingual autistic children, they show better inhibition skills than their monolingual peers. They show more social engagement in interactions. Being exposed to multiple languages can actually improve their ability to understand other people's perspective, theory of mind, which is fantastic. They tend to use gestures more frequently. Of course, it's all very, very individual, but there are so many advantages on different levels that we can absolutely say that multilingual or bilingualism enhances the development. And having said that, I'm not trying to say that bilingualism is some kind of a miracle solution or therapy, so don't get me wrong. But what it does mean for sure is that this old assumption that we have that it is harmful just doesn't hold up. It's simply not true. At worst, it doesn't have any negative impact. At best, it might offer a whole array of resources. And at best, we don't even know half of the benefits it offers.
And so from your experience working with families, what do you think happens when parents feel pressured to stop speaking their home language?
This is a big one. And it's definitely, again, one of those questions that we need to address more. And perhaps we don't because it's more convenient. But when parents are told to stop speaking their home language, for example, because just like in this one example I gave you earlier in this online event, the woman was told, just focus on Dutch because it's the school language. The consequences can be very far-reaching because parents are asked to switch to a language that is not their strongest language, that is not the language they feel comfortable in. It's not the language that they can express their most intimate feelings in, their deepest feelings. And this absolutely changes the quality of communication because parents, they may feel, and a lot of them definitely will feel less expressive. It will feel less natural. It will feel more awkward. And this emotional connection that we're trying to build and develop and sustain with our children, the quality of it is not going to be as good as it would be in a language that they could connect in better when they speak to their child. And at the same time, on the side of the child, they will lose access to conversations with family, being part of different traditions, celebrations, stories. So they will miss this connection to their identity and the language of their community. And what I'm trying to say is that it will definitely negatively impact relationships and belonging. And for many families, maintaining the home language is absolutely essential for strong family communication.
So, if there's a family out there who has received an autism diagnosis and they're navigating multiple languages at home, I'm sure it's very confusing for them. But what guidance would you actually give them when they're trying to figure out how to approach the language at home and the interaction with school and so forth?
The first thing I would tell them is don't panic and don't assume that the languages you have in your family are going to be a problem. Don't automatically assume this. As I said before, the research shows that bilingualism itself is not the problem, and it actually enhances the child's development, the child's quality of life. It enables them to connect with more people and to see different perspectives. And what's important here and what really matters in these situations is how communication happens in the family, how it is addressed on an individual level, on this nuclear family level. Because as you mentioned at the very beginning, every child with autistic spectrum disorder is very, very different. And applying a blanket solution like stop speaking this language and focus on the one language because they're struggling as it is an absolute travesty of an approach. They're so individual, and so the approach needs to be very individual as well. And as I mentioned before, one important strategy is to speak the language you're most comfortable in, the language you feel most expressive in as a parent, as a caregiver. Don't switch only because a professional, like not even doctors, always know how to approach the issue of multilingualism. If you're in doubt, seek a second, seek a third opinion. Don't automatically follow the advice to drop a language, because if that language that you're planning on switching to, let's say that's the community language, if it's not your strongest one, your communication will definitely be more limited and it's going to be way less natural. Children, autistic children or not, they all benefit from rich, meaningful interaction in the language their parents speak best, and in the language their parents have the opportunity to build the strongest connection. Another strategy is to focus on communication rather than trying to chase some standard of perfection, if you will, because it's all about interaction, sharing attention, responding to your child, building those routines and the predictable communication patterns. Because again, I'm not generalizing, but a lot of autistic children really thrive and need this predictability. Another strategy is to use multiple ways of communicating. Again, all autistic children are different and they deal with life differently. They have very different needs. So you can include gestures and visuals and routines, shared activities, even your tone of voice. Of course, you know your child best. Every parent, caregiver, they know their child best, so they can decide what the best way is. And there is a lot of advice on ways to communicate with your child depending on their needs. But many autistic children benefit from communication that combines different channels. And this can work beautifully in multilingual environments. One last bit that I don't want to miss is that you need to look at your whole child, not just the number of languages, but at your child as a whole. As I said before, autistic children have very individual communication profiles. Some may speak later, some may prefer certain languages, some may mix languages using different patterns, but none of this is a sign that those languages are harming them. It's just how they prefer to communicate and to express themselves. So what really can support your children is consistent, meaningful communication with the people who matter most. Because as another thing that you mentioned earlier, the need for connection. And with some autistic children, this is even stronger. And if we drop a home language, we're erasing a whole, how should I say, a whole channel of connection to your child. This is perhaps not the best way to express it, but I can't think of a different word at the moment.
So now that we've got you here online, maybe this is where we can get a bit more practical. What are some practical strategies that really support communication in multilingual autistic children?
Well, one thing, and I'm repeating myself, but it doesn't matter. Do not limit or stop the exposure of the home language, because when families are encouraged to do that, it can weaken a child's bond with extended family and cut them off from a very important part of their identity. We should also avoid withholding multilingual exposure purely out of fear, because language is one of the main tools that children have for connection, for learning, for communication. And autistic children deserve access to those opportunities just as much as any child. Dropping a language, what you're doing effectively is robbing them of opportunities. And you don't want to do this to your child. Another important point is that we should not reduce the quality or quantity of interactions for the sheer reason that we are worried about language overload. What children need most, again, I'm repeating myself, but this is something that needs to be repeated, is rich and responsive communication. Because every conversation, every gesture, every bit of communication contributes to their development. It's a way for us to connect with them and to pass on a language. And this is especially important when children have differences in communication or in executive functioning. Because, well, ultimately, the key is to follow the child's interests, pace, and their individual needs, rather than making blanket assumptions that multilingualism, bilingualism is simply too much for them to handle. I find this is just absolutely nonsensical, especially having in mind the amount of research and the research outcomes. To withhold a language simply because they're struggling as it is. So we don't want to add to this. We don't want to make it worse for them. Absolutely not. Because this is not actually support. It's an oversimplification of what is often a very nuanced reality and a very nuanced personality that your child has.
Well, thank you for that. And I guess to wrap it up, what would you like parents and equally professionals, I guess, to understand about this topic?
One very important thing, autism diagnosis does not cancel out bilingualism. If there is one sentence to take away from our conversation today, let it be this sentence. Because bilingualism doesn't harm autistic children. And families should not be forced to give up their languages because of some outdated assumptions or so-called common sense or somebody's gut feeling. Because everybody has opinions, but science has answers, and this is what science says. Families shouldn't be forced to give up their languages, and we absolutely need environments where children can grow up with all the languages that matter in their lives. It helps them build connection, and it helps them develop their language, because language is never just, in quotation mark, a learning tool. It's a bridge for them to connect with their family and to feel like they belong.
Thank you so much, Mimi. And if you stayed with us until the end of this conversation, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something. Sometimes episodes like this one are the ones we hesitate to press play on. Because when topics like autism enter our lives, even as a possibility, it can feel heavy. Sometimes we avoid the conversation because saying the words out loud can make it feel even more real. So if this is something that has been on your mind, and if you've listened all the way through today, I just want to say thank you for being here. And I also want to gently remind you of something that came up throughout this episode. Every child is different. Autism is a spectrum of experiences and abilities and developmental paths. There is no single trajectory. There is no single right way for families to navigate language or identity or communication. But what we do know from the growing body of research is that bilingualism itself does not create additional language delays in autistic children. But more importantly than any single study is the understanding that families deserve flexibility. Your language plan can change. It can adapt, and it can evolve as your child grows and as your family learns what works best. Just like Mimi always reminds us, it's a living document. And as our understanding of neurodiversity continues to grow, we will also need to keep adapting how we apply science to the realities families are living with. Because neurodivergent populations, including autism, are becoming more visible in our communities, our schools, and our families. And that means that the conversations about language, development, and support must evolve alongside this reality. So wherever you and your child are on this journey, I hope today's conversation gave you something valuable. Maybe reassurance, maybe information, maybe simply the feeling that you're not navigating these questions alone. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.